Welcome to this final part in my series playing Europa Universalis 4 with no DLC. In this video I want to talk about the two objectives I set at the beginning of the series. That was to answer the question of whether if you are someone who's completely new to the game and want to learn the game mechanics, is it possible to learn the game playing with no DLC, just the base game? And the answer to that is yes. And then the second objective of this series was to decide on whether you got a full experience playing the game with no DLC, and could you play it in the long term. And the answer to that is yes and no, because it will depend very much on your approach to the game. So let's return to point one. If you are someone who's watched people playing EU4 on YouTube, been really fascinated with the game like me. I mean, I was a completely new player. I wouldn't even classify myself even as an experienced player now. I've got about 65 hours into the game now by playing these series, and I must admit I found playing the game with no DLC very useful. And the reason for that is that probably the best way is to illustrate the point. If I come in here and show you the army recruitment screen, and if I click on here, what you will see is that the army recruitment is got no thrills attached. All the quality of life mechanics are missing. Now this is very useful when you are first starting out, because despite the fact that you're playing the base game, you are not playing an old game that was released, I think, about 5 years ago. You are still playing a game that's very much up to date with the latest DLC, which is Dharma, because Paradox have this policy of always releasing free DLC as part of the game. So the base game is still very strong and relevant to the latest DLC. And probably the best way to explain that is if I come here, if I can find here, you can see after the Dharma release you can now play estates. This means that by playing without the DLC you have far higher level of exposure to the game mechanics, and from the perspective of a new player that is very useful, because let's get away from that, it's a little bit crowded. Because you have to engage with the mechanics, especially in relation to managing armies, moving armies, because like another example is down here. If I wanted to move this army here, I'll just merge it up to Spain, I would have to cross the water. Now in one of the DLCs there is an option to auto transport an army from here to here across the water, and the game will do it automatically once we're using transports, although there's no transports in this area. I think the transports are up here, so I'd have no, those are actually galleys anyway. But when you're playing the base game you've got to do that manually, and you've got to learn that mechanic through, and it's the same when you fight and maneuver armies and recruit. If you come here and you want to recruit armies, you've got to sit down here and say, I've got a force limit, so you've got to do this. So where if you've got the right DLC, there's an option down here to build army templates, which then allow you to just click on that template and say I want a 25 stack army, and the game just goes away, assuming you've got the money to do it, and recruits that army. And I think that's very useful from the perspective of a new player, because you're exposed to the base mechanics of the game, you get your head around it, you start to understand it. It's the same with suppressing rebels, which is what this army is really doing down here. Managing unrest in the game is a real pain in the neck, and I'm going to be completely honest about it, guys, especially when you first start out, especially if you've never played any Paradox game. Unrest can be a real pain in the neck because you can't manage it automatically. I mean, there is an option in here. If I click this army here, there is an option here. You can say enable suppressing revolts. That's about the highest you can go, but this army will manage it. But when you've got more of the DLC, what happens is you've got more advanced options for managing unrest, and those options are pretty effective. And also the same also applies to diplomacy. If I come here, you'll see there's some tabs missing where you can automate some elements of diplomacy. while that's great for the advanced player, for the new player it's very easy to click those buttons but you don't know what's actually happening. So what I would recommend, guys, is that if you are someone who's interested in playing EU4 and want to learn the game, just buy the base game. If you can get it in the sale, fantastic. Buy the base game. And what I would recommend is, once you've got the base game, get in, play some short campaigns. I started with the Ottomans. Most people will say, why did you start with the Ottomans? But if you want to learn basic diplomacy and how to fight wars, the Ottomans is a great place, great kingdom to start, because you're exposed, you can get in there, you're strong enough, you can fight some battles, and it's a very good way to learn the basic combat mechanics of Europa Universalis 4. And then, as I've been playing this campaign over here as Castile, the focus of this was very much about learning the colonial game, as it's called, because I built this Castilian Brazil down here. Again, it is a very good way to learn the colonial game. Now, I think that is probably now a good entrance into me talking about the second objective of this series, which is it a good playing experience to play Europa Universalis 4 with no DLC? And I said yes and no. And for the same reasons as I said for point 1, if you want to play short campaigns, learn the game in Europe, and I'm going to emphasize in Europe, and by Europe I'm using a fairly broad definition of Europe, not just Central Europe. I'm saying going out to Lithuania, maybe Muscovy, and out and maybe down to the Middle East and through North Africa. Yes, you can get a really great playing experience playing with no DLC. So I'm about 90 years into the game. What happens is, when you get to a certain point, bearing in mind that you've got to go to 18 something, if I remember correctly, 1821 I think it is, what happens is that your empire starts to get really big, and that's the point when you start to miss the quality of life enhancements, because managing a large empire, especially if you get into a large war, I mean, I experienced this. I played France, and I still am playing France at the moment, and I'm about 150 years in. I've done really well. I've expanded down a little bit into Spain, and I've been expanding east in Europe. I've had a war with England, and what happens is that once you start getting into big wars, not having those quality of life enhancements starts to tell on you, because you end up spending a lot of time micromanaging units, especially if you start to lose armies and you're trying to recruit. This is where this mechanic comes in over here, where you've got the template. I know there's one there, and you can build a template, you can click, you can recruit an army, and there's nothing more irritating that you need to raise a 20 stack army, and you're doing this, coming here, and you're trying to, well, I can't do it here, but just to follow on here, you're trying to raise this army very, very quickly and keep the war going. That starts to become frustrating, guys, and that's why I'm saying that if you want the full EU4 experience, it starts to grind a bit if you want to play full-length campaigns, and it also starts to apply if you want to start to play in other areas of the map. Say you want to come out here, because the map is really big, and say for example you wanted to play a kingdom in Africa, under the Indian subcontinent, which is definitely here, or China. This is where you start to miss the immersion packs. Once you're away from Europe, the immersion packs count, because what happens is that if you play India or in the Far East, yes, you can play it, and if you watch other players on YouTube playing, you start to think, well, why can't I do this, why can't I do that? And of course what you suddenly realise is that the immersion pack is missing, and what you're effectively playing is a European country in India, and that starts to detract from the gameplay. Not in a big way. I mean, if you really want to play India with the base game, you can still play it, but I've found with a little bit of experimental test plays of very short 10-year campaigns, that's when the overall playing experience starts to grind. Right, guys, I think I've gone on long enough. What I want to do now is just bring this video to an end, and I'll do that by going back over those key points. From point 1, is it worth buying EU4 if you're interested in the game? And the answer I would definitely say is yes, because the base game is a good way to learn the game mechanics and get into the game. And probably the best way to say it is that, bearing in mind the steep learning curve that this game has, and you've got to put the effort in, guys. Don't buy the game and expect to learn how to play the game and be able to play the game to an advanced level within about 10 hours of gameplay. You're talking 30-40 hours. I mean, I'm going to be honest, guys, it was about 30-35 hours of experimental gameplay, starting new campaigns, trying things out, making lots of mistakes before I started to feel comfortable even making this series, playing the basics. And so you need to put the effort in to do it, but it's certainly worth it if you're interested. And playing the base game, you do get in, you do learn the mechanics. But, and this leads into the second point, eventually if you want to take the game further, and to be honest, if you're still playing the base game and you've got 50-60 hours in, maybe it's time now to start thinking about going to the next level, buying some of the DLC. What I did is I've been looking around the forums and watched a few YouTube videos, and there is a general consensus amongst more experienced players who are helping new players of what DLC to get first. I'm just going to read them through now, just for any of you guys that are interested, and I've got them in some kind of order. Now, I can't vouch whether the order's correct because I don't own these DLCs. I will be buying the DLCs in the near future, and I've never played them, so I can't say what features you gain by playing them. And the general consensus is there's 4 DLCs which are essential to play the game to the next level, and that is the Art of War, Common Sense, Rights of Man, and Cossacks. And there is an honourable mention which some people talk about, and that is Wealth of Nations and Mandate of Heaven. Now, I'm not going to get into a debate over which one's advantages, and what I will probably do is just buy a couple of them, probably buy Art of War. Art of War seems to be the one that most people recommend because that allows you to manage armies. Probably Art of War, Common Sense, and then I'll play the game some more, and then I'll just keep adding DLCs as I go along. And then if you've got a pressing need to play in another part of the world, I mean it's a big part of the world, that's when you want to start maybe targeting some of the more immersive DLCs such as Dharma if you want to play out in India, because Dharma adds a lot to the Indian kingdoms down here. And I think I'm starting to ramble now, guys, so I think this is where I'm going to leave it. Hope you enjoyed the video, hope you found it interesting. If you've got any comments and questions about my experience or learning the game, feel free to chuck them in the video description and I will try and answer them for you. And on that note, I think this is where I'm going to leave it, so whatever you do, enjoy your gaming.